Interesting things also about the heart is that we know that it actually starts beating before the brain is formed, which means that the heart has its own beat. In other words, the heart itself begins to beat without any central nervous system. Now, the dominant theory is that the central nervous system is what's controlling the entire human being from the brain. And yet we know now that the nervous system does not initiate the beat of the heart, that it's actually self-initiated. And we also know, or we would say initiated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also we know now that the entire heart, all of the connections to the brain can be severed in a heart transplant, and another heart can be put into a human being's body, and the heart continues to beat without any connection to the brain whatsoever, because we cannot regenerate nerve cells. So the fact that the heart itself is not only the center of the human being, but it is not beating because of the brain, because of the central nervous system. Now, another interesting thing about the brain is that the human being, there are many actually people that think that the brain is also the center of consciousness. And yet the Quran very clearly states, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts that they're not able to think with, or they're not able to understand with. And so the understanding from that, according to the Muslims, is that the center of the intellect, the center of human consciousness, is the heart and not the brain itself. And it's only recently that human beings have realized that there are over 40,000 neurons in the heart. In other words, there are actually cells in the heart that are communicating, and there's understood to be a two-way communication between the brain and the heart. In other words, the brain sends the heart messages, but the heart is also sending the brain message. And these things are only recently being discovered. There was a study done by two physiologists in the 70s, John and Beatrice Lacey, that found that the brain actually sent messages to the heart, but the heart did not automatically obey the messages. Sometimes it speeded up, and other times it slowed down, indicating that the heart itself has its own type of intelligence. Now, the brain gets signals from the heart that reach the amygdala, the thalamus, and the cortex, which relates to emotions. The cortex, or the neocortex, relates to learning and reasoning. And these are only recently discovered, and we don't fully understand them. But what we do know is that the heart is an extremely sophisticated organ, and it's also, according to the hadith, it's a source of knowledge. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that wrong action is what irritates the heart, and you do not desire other people to see it. So the heart actually knows wrong action, and this is one of the reasons why people can do terrible things, but ultimately they're affected. If you look, for instance, in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, what the brilliant Russian author was indicating in that story was that the crime itself is the punishment, because human beings have to live with the results of their actions. And that the soul, when somebody does a crime, when somebody does something that is against the heart, is against the soul, then that actually affects the human being to the degree that they will go into a state of spiritual agitation, and they will use many, many ways to cover this up. This is what kufr is. It's a covering up. They will use alcohol, they will use drugs, they will use sexual experiment, they will use all seeking power, seeking wealth, seeking fame, all of these ways to try to basically to go into a state of heedlessness, into a state of submersion into the world that makes us forget our essential nature, that makes us forget our hearts. And so people become very cut off from their hearts. Now, one of the things about being cut off from the heart is that the more cut off from the heart you get, the sicker the heart gets, because the heart needs nourishment. And heedlessness is basically starving the spiritual heart. When you go into a state of unawareness, of lack of awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of your ultimate concern, which is the akhirah, the infinite world in relation to the finite world, that we're only in this world for a temporary period. And so that when you look at the infinite world in relation to the finite world, suddenly your concerns become focused on the infinite world and not on the finite world. And yet, when somebody is completely immersed in the finite world, believing that they will be here forever, believing that they will not be taken into account for their actions, that this action in and of itself ultimately leads to the spiritual death of the heart.